Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's Couch Coding Drupal Performance. Your experts for today are Pantheon co-founders Matt Cheney and David Strauss. Just a couple of housekeeping items to go over before we start. Please make sure you submit any questions you have during the presentation in the question window. We want to answer as many of your questions as possible, so make sure you keep them coming. Also, this webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be made available to everyone next week. I'd now like to turn it over to Matt and David.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Couch Coding Drupal Performance webinar. This is the picture of someone, I think, evading the police with several cop cars and a helicopter. We don't recommend that, but we do recommend going fast. And that's sort of the topic of today's conversation, is how to make Drupal go fast. And I think sort of to kick it off, we're definitely we have a little deck just to talk about some like Drupal performance problems and sort of solutions to how to make, some tips to make Drupal fast and some ways to debug Drupal. We're going to show off some performance testing tools, this load impact tool I've been playing around with, and we have some integration code to use with Pantheon. I'm going to show off a little bit of new Relic, which is an application performance management tool we have now bundled with the platform, the pro version, because you're all professionals, of course. And then we'll do some questions. Cool. So if you have any questions, you can go in and add them in the GoToWebinar question piece, and then we'll answer them. Unless they're super offensive, then we probably won't. But I don't feel this topic is that controversial. I feel everyone really does want to go fast. And I think sort of to talk about that, there's a lot of reason why having a fast website is going to be important. I think probably the biggest is just we're increasingly living in a world where people have really short attention spans. They're reading 140 character tweets and they're checking little ads and small little snips of information. It's not really like a long form society anymore. And websites can't be long form.
And the issues you see on a desktop experience, the website, only get amplified more when you start looking at mobile experiences, slower networks, higher latencies. So if you're not getting an ideal experience for desktop users, then that's really where to start in terms of the application stack.
Correct. And I think there's a lot of data actually that backs this up. Here's an infographic that I found on the internet, which is likely true, seems reasonable. Basically, for every second of page delay in load time, you see a loss of conversions if you're doing a sort of e-commerce or call to action kind of situation. You see people with different page views, looking at stuff on your site, and then you see a decrease in just overall customer satisfaction.
And this isn't even encapsulating the entire penalty you're paying here, because this is just looking at loss in conversions, which means that they've come to the website in the first place. And Google actually prioritizes the rank of faster responding sites as well. So they may not even come in the front door. You might not even know that you're missing customers at the point where your website's not responding fast enough.
Okay. So you want your website to be fast, of course. Usain Bolt fast to be in the cultural zeitgeist. Should include actually a picture of him on this deck. It's unfortunate we didn't, and I apologize to everyone for that. We're going to give you some good tips on how to actually, go really fast, and that doesn't include diving over the finish line, because you're going to keep going. You don't want to just stop after 400 meters or whatever. But one of the things I think sort of want to stress, and I have a sort of sense here that a lot of us on the sort of webinar are going to be developers. We're going to be trying to think about when should we actually do performance work? When should we optimize our websites? And I think I would sort of say, the sort of times you really want to sort of optimize your websites, but to think really seriously about fixing performance issues is of course before a major launch or event. You want to review your site before it goes live, or if you have a conference, you want to review it before the conference starts, or the school year starts, or whatever event. And then you also want to jump in when you actually have a problem. That performance is something that could be very complicated to diagnose and to improve, and it's something that you don't want to do prematurely. That one of the things that we see some developers fall into the trap is that they'll sort of start building a site and they'll start doing performance tests and they'll see things that are slow, but they're only 10%, 50% of the project. So a lot of the work you do to sort of optimize to that level is very premature.
And a lot of avoiding premature optimization comes down to measuring the right things, which is looking at the end user experience of accessing the website, performing transactions on it, loading pages, and not focusing on micro optimizations where you're at some deep level of the stack, you see a 20% variation, but you're not necessarily seeing problems at the end user level.
That's important because at the end of the day, what you really care about, which is all ultimately you ever should care about for anything, is sort of what people want, what their experience is, how they perceive how fast it is. That, it's that sort of like response that like the human has when they're engaging with the website. That's going to be ultimately what matters. And
yeah,
focusing on those metrics is important.
And I see all the time people looking at the page generation time of, say, Drupal, where it might be 900 milliseconds, and they're focusing on getting that down when the actual end user render time in the browser is hovering around 5 seconds.
A lot more room to trim on that sort of 4.1 seconds of render time than the 900-second generation time.
900 milliseconds.
Milliseconds, for sure. 900 seconds would be a lot. I don't know if I wait for, maybe some sites I wait that long for.
Burning Man tickets.
Yes. 15-minute load times. And I think sort of one of the other sort of tips we have, just Drupal performance, is that you want to use the data to do a lot of the performance work. That like there are really good tools to actually do testing of sites and review of tests on sites. We'll show off some of those tools. And focus on that kind of data decision. Look at where is the most time being spent on the load. Where can we actually optimize that? That there's really great tools to figure stuff out. You should use those tools. And two of the tools that I'll be talking about today, or we'll be talking today, one is this tool Load Impact. It's a performance testing tool. There are many load testing tools out there. This is one I've used. At the end of the day, you're really just simulating traffic through using bots and stuff, and it's easier to use sort of a web service you can connect to and have an API to than trying to like go on IRC and like pay Bitcoin to get botnets to simulate traffic. Like that's a lot of work. Load Impact's a little easier.
Although we have seen that sort of quote traffic simulation against Pantheon before for some dissident websites.
Yes, state actors are difficult actors for sure. You shouldn't go to their plays. And then we'll also be talking about New Relic. New Relic's a tool that while probably a crazier sort of UI than an airplane dashboard, can do magical things like airplanes can do. And that New Relic is something that is now bundled for free for all Pantheon sites for all people. And you can turn that on and play around with it and get a lot of really good information. And I think one of the sort of patterns we're going to try to suggest to you is that you should do testing using a testing tool, simulating traffic. And then you should use something like New Relic to evaluate that test traffic, as well as to evaluate the live traffic as well, and get a sense of how your site's performing. And that's going to help you out a lot. Those are sort of those data-driven decisions involved. But I'd also say that you should also trust your intuition on some of this stuff. That as sort of developers, you've obviously made the good choice to check out some of the stuff Pantheon has, and trust keeping that intuition going, looking at those best practices, and some of those tips and stuff can be really helpful. So, if you got performance issues, you're going to have some people that are upset. You'll hear complaints. You want to look at the data, have a problem. You'll do some work. And so here's 5 things sort of I'll put out there just to sort of quickly check for performance. These aren't going to be sort of crazily, kind of like, tips, but just stuff I say, hey, if you're looking for performance, you should always sort of check out these things. So they are, tips in order. Is Varnish working appropriately? Is Drupal caching appropriately? Do you have a CDN to deliver your traffic? Is your host a good one? And is your page load as sort of the assets you're loading on the page same? These are just 5 things. There's 50 we could go through, but I found this nice picture of a hand, so I sort of wanted to correspond to 1 for each finger and stuff. So that was sort of where that came from. So the first thing I'd sort of throw out there for folks who are trying to do performance work is that, for many cases that involve sort of unauthenticated users, like people just reading the same blog post over and over and over again because they really like it, or multiple people reading the same blog post. We offer a tool called Varnish on the platform. It's a reverse proxy cache. It'll basically take the HTML that's generated from the Drupal and it will just spit that back out without actually having to go to PHP at all. And it's awesome. It can give you about a 200 times performance increase over what you might be used to, and you get it all sort of by default on Pantheon.
And I recommend also, if you pass a check like this, which is just checking whether the main page itself is hitting Varnish, that if you're doing anything with, say, Ajax or other potentially dynamic requests on the same page, running it through something like either a CDN optimization checker that makes sure that your other assets on the page that are dynamic are also getting cached, or if you know exactly the dynamic assets, running them through this same Varnish check to make sure those are getting cached too. Because I've seen several cases where a site has the main page cached and then it has an Ajax request for some sort of information on the page, and that goes to something that doesn't get cached. And so they get great performance for the main page until the backend goes down because another request is bypassing the cache.
Yeah, because the theory with Varnish is that like it'll do caching if it thinks that all the pages it's supposed to are asked for are the same. But there are things you can do, like doing Ajax requests on page loads or setting cookies in your code that will actually bypass the Varnish cache. It'll break the Varnish cache. Now, sometimes you want to do that. Like if you're logging into a Drupal site, you do want each logged in user to have a different set of options and content. But if you're doing a sort of setting a cookie and you're not expecting that to happen, you can really seriously cause problems with your page load. Varnish check is a sort of is a tool we have to actually check out some of that kind of stuff. And then, like David said, checking other subpages and looking at sort of Ajax requests and checking those as well is really helpful. And if you're seeing like significant decreases in performance, this could be something to check out. Second one is making sure Drupal is doing some caching or optimization. I think the two things sort of at the bottom around aggregating CSS, aggregating JavaScript files is particularly important. Luckily in Drupal 8, these are now default options. Basically what happens is when you have a Drupal, like, with all the different modules and themes and all the different stuff, every individual page load actually is going to have a ton of different little CSS files, a ton of little JavaScript files that are all loaded. So you'll have something like 30, 40, 50 different assets that are being loaded each time. Turns out that having a browser load 50 assets all at once can sort of slow it down. And then, if you don't have the CSS, you can't have the styling as much. Drupal has some options. We'll just take all the CSS, take all the JavaScript, and we'll like mash it together, and then only send you a few different files you have to download. And that can help make your stuff faster.
My hope with these things like aggregation is that they somewhat decline as necessities as things move more toward HTTP2, which we're going to talk about CDNs in a little bit, but the right way to deliver that sort of thing is with a CDN. And then with HTTP2, the aggregation happens at more the protocol level where it can send the request simultaneously over one connection. It all gets compressed better for each request, and you largely get the same benefits at a different level of the stack than by aggregating the files.
Which we all will look forward to that in the future. The other piece is that Drupal actually has this caching option that says patch cage maximum age. David, could you talk a little bit about sort of that option and how it works with Varnish?
This option does two things that in Drupal 7 and 8 are coupled in the sense that you basically turn them both on at once or both off at once through this interface at least. And those two things are the internal page cache in Drupal, where it actually tries to snapshot a page that an anonymous user has loaded and then stores it in Drupal's own cache for that duration. And then it also sends a header downstream that instructs caches like Varnish to be able to hold on to that anonymous page and be able to deliver that cached page to end users without having to hit Drupal at all. So you almost always want to turn this on. One thing we recommend for most cases on systems like Pantheon is you should at least consider the idea of setting up something like a dump null cache for the page, because Drupal will still generate the page cache item, try and store it in its cache. This can sometimes have a tiny, tiny benefit if you have multiple front-end caches like we do on Pantheon, where Drupal can hit its cache if you go through a different Varnish box. But I don't usually think that that complexity is worth the overhead in the CMS. So I typically recommend setting this to something substantial, and then trying to basically have Drupal's page cache go to a black hole so that it's not actually populating the cache with page assets, which can be rather large.
Yep. Excellent. The other tip that I think is really important and something that, like, you know, many of you actually are not doing at the moment, but you should totally consider is adding a CDN on front of your site.
Yep. And this is true for many reasons. This is what we believe the right way to deliver HTTP2 to a site is. And the reason why is because HTTP2 is primarily a last mile optimization where it's sort of between, it assumes that you're connecting from an end user device like a laptop to infrastructure like a point of presence for a CDN, and that last mile connection is where a lot of the latency is, which is almost always the case, especially with mobile devices. And so by deploying something like HTTP2 with a CDN, you're not only dramatically reducing the number of rounds of communication with the web service, you're also bringing that communication loop much closer to the end device. And so for things like HTTPS negotiation, for things like loading a bunch of assets, you're optimizing many things all at the same time.
And CDN, of course, stands for Content Delivery Network. It's basically yet another cache that you can set up. Typically, you point your DNS at that cache. That cache then, you know, when someone hits it, it can request the Pantheon site as an origin, and it can serve information that way.
And we particularly like Fastly because they've gone really far when it comes to supporting Drupal 8 with their stuff. For example, they support long-form cache tagging of pages in a way that Cloudflare doesn't yet support for Drupal 8. So you can actually take advantage of Drupal 8's cache tagging and invalidation with Fastly today if you want to do sophisticated cache management for your pages.
And you probably want to. Like, one of the awesome features in Drupal 8 is this cache tag system. Because there's this, Drupal as a CMS, of course, generates each page using a variety of different entities or objects within inside of Drupal. On a given page, you might have some nodes, you might have a user profile for like an author, you might have some taxonomy terms, and each of those items are things that are all necessary to create that fresh page. And one of the problems you might have had in Drupal 5, 6, 7 is that if you, for example, change the user profile picture, it wouldn't necessarily know that on the blog page, which shows that picture, that needs to be like, that cache needs to be refreshed. It just wasn't aware that user object mattered to that page. Or if you added something for a taxonomy term, like update its description, it might not appropriately populate. Drupal 8's way better. It knows which assets are needed for each page load, and if you change one of those assets, it can smartly invalidate just those caches for which those assets depend to regenerate them, which is very helpful.
Yeah, and given that running commercial websites is all about traffic acquisition and conversion, and by conversion I mean like getting your users to view or do whatever you want to accomplish on your website, HTTPS also factors now into Google's rankings. So initial traffic acquisition often gets optimized by deploying that. And the best way to implement something like HTTPS is by doing it with a CDN so that negotiation happens much closer to the client, because you don't want round trips going all the way back to the origin servers for every connection to the website. And you also want it to be able to be cached closer to the user as well. This particularly becomes relevant for mobile sites because if you're deploying technologies like Google AMP for optimized mobile loading, where it's able to have a lightweight version of the page, most of those technologies require that you deliver those pages over HTTPS now. So the only way you can get an ideal deployment of that sort of thing without paying a lot of the costs that we're accustomed to paying with HTTPS is by delivering it through a CDN.
So definitely, if you have CDN questions, definitely ask them. David and I are both very passionate around CDNs, and we think there's a lot of new cool technologies being implemented by CDNs that you can take advantage of that'll help your performance out a lot.
And you can get most of these benefits with other CDNs as well. Most of these are not specific to Fastly.
Yeah, there's a whole wide world of CDNs out there. Ask us anything. Another good tip is you need to make sure if you're hosting Drupal that you host with a good host. We recommend Pantheon. But realistically, I think just, from a sort of broad picture, like hosting a Drupal application is a different kind of thing than hosting other maybe less complicated applications or static sites. That there's setups and configurations you need to do to both PHP and to MySQL to make sure that like your actual site is running quickly. And having a host that knows Drupal and has made those configurations is very, very important.
And one of the things that we've focused on that we think is important when you're working with performance and scalability for a site is making sure that your production environment is at least as performant as what you're testing on. And one of the issues we designed Pantheon from the beginning to confront is where people test and build sites sort of on single VMs or single nodes, and then their database and their cache and their web server are all on the same machine, and that hides all of your network latency. And when you have an application like Drupal that's accessing 100 or 200 cache items per page and possibly running even 100 or 200 queries on a page, that latency and that round trip, same thing for the file system as well, those latencies in that round trip can dramatically add a penalty of performance to a page that you need to be accounting for all the way through the development process. Otherwise, you can develop a site that works great on single node, even great on load tests, and then you find out that the page load times are 2 to 3 times slower in a production environment. And you can't escape that really in the production environment, because to maintain high availability, you necessarily need a network separation between nodes. And so you get caught in this situation unless you have representative test environments.
And that's a good best practice, you know, for performance testing as well as just bug testing. You want your test environment to be as identical as possible to performance environment or to the production environment. Pantheon obviously provides that. Other hosts provide that as well. But you ask about that. That's an important thing. Otherwise, you're gonna be like, oh, the tests work great. It's awesome. And then you launch, and then, you know, bad news. And you wouldn't want to launch a site and have it go down. That would be very sad.
It can actually be for surprising reasons that you might not even load test. Like one common thing that I've seen is where someone uses WYSIWYG, and then they have a content browser for all the media assets, and then that is trying to list all the files in maybe some gigantic upload directory, and that's the sort of thing that can work great on a local machine, the local file system, and then you throw it onto a network file system for high availability, and the performance aspects just completely change, and it can basically lock up those processes, and all you need is an editor to try and do that 10 times, and they've locked up all of, or at least a substantial portion of your PHP workers.
And it's sort of hard to figure that out too, because sometimes it's like, oh well, just whenever like a particular, you know, web admin comes in and starts messing with the media assets, the site goes down. So like, you know, having some ability to sort of like figure out what's going on is important. Otherwise, you're just having all your friends just joke about your daily downs and like, you're like, ah. And some of the application monitoring stuff, which with New Relic, can help you really sort of figure out what's going on if you have mystery performance issues. Last little tip, just in like the sort of quick 5 I came up with, was you also want to look at your page load and figure out sort of which assets you're loading and what order they're loading and stuff like this. So there's the tool Firebug that helps you to like do a lot of web development, but it also will show you the actual assets you load on each page. It's definitely worth checking those out, because in many cases you need to get a bunch of assets already downloaded in order to actually like render the page appropriately. And just seeing, you know, how big are your images and like how many files you have and in what order they're loaded can be helpful.
And in this modern day of especially kind of advertising-driven sites or ones where you have lots of analytics, it's really important to use these sorts of tools to look at what is the page load time for the usability of the page, rather than after every single potential asset's loaded, because it's actually pretty okay to have your page be usable in, say, a second, but then have the rest of the assets take another 5 seconds or so to finish up all of their work. Because from a human psychology perspective, they care about they're impatient to work with a page, not impatient for every single thing to be rendered on page.
Yeah, and that's often actually a pretty good strategy that we're seeing more and more of in for the web development world, is that you load sort of the initial page load to get like sort of, you know, the minimum kind of page up there for people to start engaging. But then you'll use JavaScript to actually like load, lazy load, or load later other assets that are larger, and that can be really helpful.
I'm increasingly seeing the term people using for this as interventions, in the sense that there's a typical browser way of working with it if you naively pile all the assets onto the page. And then some libraries and techniques are called interventions in the sense that you are specifically picking which assets are going to be more lazy loaded on the page, and then only allowing the browser to directly work with the assets that you consider critical to the rendering and initial usability of the page.
Yeah, so checking that out, do some optimizations there. More truth, beauty, and wisdom to you on that basis. All right, so let's talk about a little bit about testing. Obviously, if you're like running a live site right now, like your test is already in progress. But if you want to simulate a little bit of a test, sort of before you launch, or before you launch a new feature, something like that, talk a little bit about setting up a load impact kind of test. And this is going to be similar for other kinds, Blitz and IO, Locus, other kinds of tooling you might use. So in this case, like pretty straightforward. You jump in. You're going to want to sort of pick from a simple case, you can pick sort of just a URL to test. That could be your home page. It could be a blog page or whatever. Trying to get a representative sample obviously is going to be important, and that's sort of a nice way just to quickly test some sort of users.
I would even say if you don't have the time to do a representative sample, at least do something, because even the front page of your site is still going to invoke something like somewhere between 50 and 95% of the key functions and things that would potentially bottleneck on the site. Mm-hmm. So even just a very cursory load test is way better than no load test at all.
Absolutely, absolutely. But I think from actually a sort of best practice kind of approach, what you want to do for a load test is you want to test the actual user behavior of what people are going to do on your site. As a site sort of owner or developer, you probably have a decent idea of this. You can look in Google Analytics and figure out, so what are people actually doing? And a good sort of way to do this is to actually record custom scenarios for the site. So this is a tool load impact recorder you can get through the Google Com Web Store. And basically you hit start record. You go in and do some actions on your site. Maybe you log in, maybe you post a comment, maybe you do a search on the site. You go to a few pages. And it actually records what pages you went to, what forms you filled out, and with which information, what searches you did, how long you waited between typing or clicking on stuff, and it actually saves it and it's sort of recording. And you can do the same thing recording Selenium tests or other kinds of test scenarios. But the idea is that you want to create sort of this virtual experience of as a user, what would actually that look like? And then you can load it in and actually run those custom tests as part of your sort of test suite. So that instead of just, sort of just hammering one page over and over again, it's actually going to have a sort of, a virtual user, a VU, go in and do the different kinds of actions and engagements that you would expect someone to do. And this is great because this allows the robots to go first, to try the site. And if it's slow, they don't really care right now as much about that experience. They're not going to be upset with you right now. But they will do all the things that your end users will do. And in many cases, they'll do it, even in some cases, with the same browsers, user agents, loading JavaScript, loading ads, and stuff like that.
This also brings up another aspect of a good architecture, whether you're picking a hosting provider or DIYing it, which is you want some performance and resource isolation between your testing environment and your production environment. Because the easiest way to get a representative test environment is to co-deploy it with production. Yes. But it's also the first way that you make this sort of load testing the sort of thing that brings down your production site, even though you're testing your test site.
Yeah, let me run 1,000 users on my test site and see how much it can take. If it's on the same machine as or even shares some of the same machines, right? Maybe it just has the same database as the production site. If there's enough load on that database because of your test, then your production site's going to suffer, and that's the worst, right? You're trying to make it faster, but you end up making it slower. I mean, it's you actually won't make that joke. Pantheon has pretty good resource isolation. Your database, your files, your PHP are separately and functionally different from your live site. So you can hammer the test site, and it won't affect your production site, and that's a good thing. Okay, once you actually run the test, once you actually get that information, load impact and some other performance tools will give you some metrics for what's happening. And they might be worth looking at. It'll show you sort of average load time per user, some other stuff. But realistically, like a load testing tool only knows sort of what it knows about the system. Like it doesn't have any back-end awareness, right, of what's going on. It doesn't know how long certain things took, under the hood. And that's why using a tool like New Relic becomes really powerful, because New Relic actually has a sort of PHP agent that actually sits inside of PHP to figure out sort of what functions and what processing is happening behind the scenes. It also loads some JavaScript on the page to figure out what's happening sort of on the front end. This is information that's available to it that like a sort of external tool would not know.
And there are a few things that I think are really favorites for me about the way that New Relic approaches performance, and why we focused on it as sort of the tool Pantheon's opinionated platform uses. One of them is that it focuses and provides great tools for tying performance to business value. It allows you to set up things that are called things like key transactions, where they're particularly important user experiences on the site, like either loading the front page or checking out, or registering for an event. Whatever your key events are, you can put them in here, and then you are tracking the performance of those things all the way down to the front end, in the sense of the loading experience of people in the browsers, and then all the way through the back-end resources that the page is based on. The other reason I think New Relic is a great tool is because it confronts performance and scalability in a way that's actually usable and actionable for people's sites. It's great for people to say that a detailed profiling tool or things like deterministic profiling are neat things to work with, but they're really only great to work with if you already know what pages you want to profile and you have people experienced enough to set up the profiling for them. Whereas New Relic primarily functions as a sampling-based profiler of your actual live site, so it will show you the hotspots that you didn't even know you had on your site. And on Pantheon, at least, we also wire New Relic into all the test and development environments, so you can also use it as a profiling tool as well, where, say, you run a load test against the site, or even just set up something as a key transaction and manually load the page, or do that as a developer to see where the time is being spent for those resources.
And you can get graphs that look like this, which actually are very actionable. This is the test that I ran. It's about a 20-minute-ish test. And you can sort of see, like, the response times actually are pretty fast, like under 300 ms. But you can see that, like, within that, like, most of that's PHP. But there's some database stuff. And then there's also this external service kind of piece. And I would say this is helpful because those are actually different parts of the website, and they can be optimized in different ways. And understanding that's important, because a web external request, that's like some third-party request to a request to a third party. That's something that actually could be cached or could be changed in some way, because it's taking up a sizable amount of that graph. And that's something that I think sort of understanding, okay, so like it took this long to make the page, like what took that long is helpful. New Relic gives you that information. So, and it allows you to sort of break it down, right? So within the case of PHP, we can actually go in and start to like try to understand on a sort of Drupal level what actual things are causing this kind of thing to happen. So New Relic has Drupal smarts. It can tell you which modules are taking the most time. Some of this is going to get thrown off a little bit because there's stuff that happens on your site, especially on test sites like Drush, cron runs, and other things that may not necessarily be representative. But it can tell you, like, which modules are being loaded, and you're like, oh, like maybe I'm not using tour module, but it's like doing a bunch of stuff. Like maybe I should look at that or whatever. I don't have comments in my site yet. It takes 1.7 ms as part of this time-consuming piece to do it. Like maybe I should do something about that. And just knowing which modules to look at. This is great too if you have a custom module or like a sort of sketchy contrib module that like might be causing a performance issue. Like you can quickly see that that's actually what's happening.
At least Quick Edit is true to its name.
Yeah, Quick Edit 222, very nice. But I didn't use any quick edit in my test. If maybe we had done a script that showed a bunch of quick editing, maybe that could be a problem.
Yeah, the other thing that New Relic confronts with this is that you can't really do with basic profiling, is that even if you know some of the key pages on your site for a profiling perspective, you don't necessarily know exactly the distribution of users hitting one thing versus another. And New Relic has a great breakdown through its sampling of of what proportion users are hitting things. Because sometimes you might have, let's say you have one page that takes 3 seconds to load, and another that takes 2 seconds to load. Naively, you would assume that the 3-second page is the place to start optimizations. But if your users actually use the 2-second page load 100 times more frequently, then that is really where you want to be actually getting the gains and trying to eke out some reductions in load time for that. Yep, because you will just proportionally impact more of your user's experience. And page load times don't happen in isolation either, because every PHP process basically has a work queue that it's going through. And the longer it's spent, unless your site is quite idle, the longer it's spending on one page request, the longer it's taking to get to other ones as well.
And that's that kind of data-driven decision that's very important to do. It's the kind of thing that helps you prioritize your work. Relic helps you sort of get those pages, helps you understand which modules are being there, and also understand which hooks are being implemented, how long those take. So if you have some, maybe non-performant, like, node hooks, you can actually figure out which node hook it is. Is it an insert one? Is it a delete one? And sort of figure out, on a hook level what's going on. Or I think this is probably the most helpful on a sort of which views are the most unperformant. And you can look at the views, because views are actually something that there's a lot of different ways to make views faster. Views has a lot of caching options that are built into views. You can cache different parts of the view. They, of course, generate SQL on the back end, which itself can be optimized using a variety of keys or indexes. But if you have a big site and you've got 100 views, you don't want to, need to, or should go through all of them to try to optimize each individual part. You want to find the ones that are taking the most time and spend your efforts and performance working on those. Having a nice list of them helps you get that priority.
Hooks are also particularly important in Drupal 7 and 8 because we implement things like transactions now, where as soon as you're saving a node, it opens a transaction in the database, and then it goes through all of the hook save events. Mm-hmm. And when it goes through every single one of those, the transaction remains open. So you're not just adding to the page load time, you're increasing the chance of deadlocks on the site. You're also increasing the amount of time that certain locks in the database are getting held. So certain hooks, like saving nodes, fields, etc., can be particularly dangerous to lengthen.
Yep. Making more data lets you prioritize. You also can get access to the database. You can see which queries are taking the most time, and can sort of try to figure out that kind of piece. The more custom. I would also share, if you're looking just at this is just a test on Drupal core with a little bit of custom code I put in, but and I would say generally Drupal core is going to be pretty performant. True, that's also true a lot of tier 1 kind of modules that you do. They may take, cache render may take a lot of time because you're making, rendering this information. But where you're really going to see the offenders are where you start to have very custom code. And you can start to see where that takes a lot of time. Figure out what's going on, where to optimize is helpful. And then I think the last thing we sort of show is that external services can be a huge bottleneck. If in your code you're calling something like api.twitter.com as part of your page load, then the page in fact will block on waiting for the API to actually go out to the API, get it, and come back. And that could be a real problem because if it takes 300 seconds or 300 milliseconds to do an API call to some third-party service, everything about your page load stops until it happens. So that's the kind of thing where if you see a lot of external service time, that may be a place to do caching. So instead of calling the API every page load, you do it once every 5 minutes. Or it could be a situation where you actually want to offload that external service call and do it with JavaScript instead. So that maybe you load the page, and then after the page is loaded, you use JavaScript to actually get the most recent tweets or something and put them in the sidebar. This is the kind of thing you want to prioritize. This is the kind of thing you can do to make your sites faster. So I have a real site that we can actually play around with a little bit, but we're also really interested in questions. Although it was super cute that I used turtles to do a slow site. This is my slow site here. But I think sort of with that, we want to sort of turn it over to do a little bit of questions with some folks and sort of ask us things, anything about Drupal performance. And if we can show you some stuff about how to fix it on this site, we will. Otherwise, we'll just opine in other ways.
Alrighty, jumping into questions. The first one is, I think standard kind of Ajax-y patterns on Drupal use post requests, right? I remember having some challenges getting some dynamic Ajax content. We lazy loaded page elements to be GET requests so they can make it into the page cache table.
That's correct.
Yes.
Post requests by the HTTP spec are almost never cacheable because they're presumed to create what's called a mutation on the back end of the data. They cause a change to occur. So it's never considered safe for any intermediate cache to treat a post request as something that it can respond to directly.
I mean, there are ways to use JavaScript to do backend requests using the get method that just get information that is cacheable that you could then load on the page. But if you are using post, it's going to break cache, so use that sparingly.
Right, the next question is, why does Pantheon recommend not using the compressed cached pages?
Well, at least compressed cached pages in Drupal is performing it in PHP, where it's working with PHP variables and then performing the compression there before Drupal inserts it into its page cache, and or before it delivers the page downstream. But Pantheon implements page compression outside of Drupal in a way where even though Drupal's not performing page compression, we still are before it reaches the end user. So it gets compressed before it hits that important last mile to the end user, whether it's a desktop or mobile device. And it spares PHP from handling compression in that expensive PHP environment.
Right. Where can you find more information about sending Drupal page cache to dev null? Curious on best practices there.
Yep. I actually think that some of these dev null style caches, there are a few modules available for Drupal 7. I believe it's built into Drupal 8 now, the idea of a null cache backend. I know one of them is, I think, literally called dev null. And what you do is you just install the module and you configure it as a cache driver. And all it does as a cache driver is save it to nothing and always miss. So as far as Drupal is concerned, it will still generate, say, a page cache item, but it will basically not store it anywhere. So it won't take up space in the database or Redis or wherever your cache is, because it's really not the most important thing to be spending your cache space on, compared to, especially if you have something like Varnish or CDN in front of the site. But they're configured like normal cache backends. They're very, very safe to use from a correctness perspective, because not caching it and always missing isn't going to break anything on the site. It does mean that if you move something critical over to that, it could slow down the site. But I have found for some sites that are overpopulating their cache with things for, say, fields or authenticated user data, that they can sometimes be better off sending other bins to the dev null cache as well. I've also seen cases where for things like fields, if they're encountering deadlocks where they're using the database cache for something transaction critical, it sometimes is necessary to move it to dev null to avoid lock contention as well.
Right. In New Relic for my live site, I have a transaction opt/drush/drush.php that has an app server time of 6.71 seconds. How can I improve that?
Well, the first step is to look at the breakdown of where it's spending the time. As far as New Relic is concerned, a page request is called a transaction, regardless of whether it's transactional from your perspective or not. So what it does is it tries to aggregate the different transactions that are occurring. In the case here, this is looking at the different places it's spending the time. There's also a more URL-centric view, I believe, as well. I think that, whoops, sorry.
Yeah, I would also say that, like, New Relic is going to capture any engagement with the page. So one of the things that does happen on Pantheon is that drush is invoked to run cron on a regular basis. And so you'll see potentially that, like, the drush is taking a long time because cron is taking a long time. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Like, cron sometimes does take time to index pages in search or run other kinds of operations or whatever, and that, you know, that's not something that's necessarily going to have an end user see. That could just be something that's happening on the back end.
Yeah. And then it's also, I think actually the first question I would ask is if it's an issue of your user's end experience in terms of their experience using the site, or whether it's an issue of exhausting backend resources, because I would approach it a very different way. If it's an issue of it exhausting backend resources and then slowing down other elements of the site, I would start more in this area of New Relic, where it's looking at the internals of managing the page request. If it's not about the backend resources, and those are fine, and you're really just worried about the page load time for the end user, then I would actually start by analyzing the front-end performance, because even though the page load time from PHP may be 3 seconds, it could be that the majority of time to render could be caused by other things, and that the PHP time may not be the first place to start. Yep. Like, let's say you're using tons of external web fonts, you're using various forms of external assets that are blocking the rendering of the page. I've often seen cases where even if it's 3 seconds coming out of Drupal, that the render time for the end user is 10 or 15 seconds based on the other assets. And then if you determine that it is mostly dominated by PHP and Drupal and not by other front-end issues, then I would dive exactly into this part of New Relic and look at where it's spending the time. Database, web, external assets, caching, PHP itself. And then New Relic basically provides a drill down that emphasizes the biggest hits.
A couple other things I would say that I think will be important if you're looking sort of, hey, what can I do sort of right now to sort of help improve my performance my Drupal site? I mean, turning on New Relic obviously is going to be a good plan. The other piece I would say is that we have a technology called Quicksilver. It's like a platform hook system. You can learn more about it on the internet, Quicksilver. But one of the things that you can do really easily is there's a New Relic deploy hook that you just like legit just like drop in this code and set up a Pantheon YAML file, so that every time you do a deploy, it'll actually mark in New Relic when that deployment happened and help to give you comparative performance data between that deploy. So, for example, if you're looking at your New Relic data for the last 2 weeks, you may not know, and you deployed something a week ago, you might want to be interested, like, well, what happened when I did that deploy? Did it get faster? Did it get slower? Having New Relic sort of know about each of the deployments is something that's a pretty no-brainer kind of thing just to put in there. And when you look at the data later, you can understand, oh, I changed this, added this module, or I like changed this code, or added this third-party service, and now my performance is different. And so it helps you to identify what pieces of code should be reviewed to help improve as well. The other sort of quick thing in this in the sort of platform hooks, things that you can set up on Pantheon to run on each deploy, is there is a pull request that I was working on for the performance testing, where this code totally works if you want to sign up for it. Basically, what you could do is on each deploy, you can actually go ahead and run a performance test using a third-party API or using the API for load impact, so that like every time you push to test, it'll spend 5 minutes doing like a test of that test environment, and that'll generate information in Relic that you can review. That'll actually give you report backs of how fast stuff is, and it all sort of happens just as part of your deployment workflow. And so that's something, if you want to make sure you performance test every deploy, check out this pull request, pull this code, and that'll do it for you.
And I believe Load Impact actually uses full simulated browser clients, so you'll see front-end performance issues as well with Load Impact.
And more data the better, and make sure you get that data reliably and also consistently, because now you've got the same test case for every deploy, so you can sort of start to see, oh, I know how fast that deploy was. This new deploy, the numbers are way different. Maybe I should review that, and that kind of data-driven decision is really helpful.
And it also populates New Relic too with a lot of good data as Load Impact is hitting the system.
Yep.
Alrighty, next question is, how good is Calabox at matching Pantheon's environment?
So Calabox is a local development tool that is based on Docker, and it's used for local on your laptop. So we wouldn't recommend that you do like a ton of performance load testing on that, because your laptop is not going to be anything close to the server architecture that you're ultimately going to run. But Calabox actually does have we gave them the container spec that we use at Pantheon, so they run the same versions of PHP, MariaDB, and the other stuff as well.
So it's a great way to make sure that the code works. It's not really the right target for Well, if you want to do more deterministic profiling, I see Matt pulling up Xdebug, or let's say if you wanted to use something like XHProf, that's the sort of thing that I would focus on doing on your local machine, because that sort of profiling is not so much based on as much real-world sampling as much as like tracing a path through the system and finding out where a hotspot is for a specific request or function.
Yeah, so like quickly, like Xdebug is basically a debug and profiling tool for PHP, where it will review sort of a single page load and show you which functions call other functions, how long they take, and sort of in what order they're called. That's something that you actually can't do on Pantheon, but you can do on Calobox or on other local development tools. And that's a good situation to review if you're just sort of trying to understand, a single request. The problem with that is that you can definitely find problems there, and we think it's a good way to sort of review, but it's not as good information as, well, what happens if 1,000 users go to your site? Because that's sort of what you're ultimately trying to optimize for. But something like Calobox would help you get an Xdebug.
All right. Our next question is, I wanted Drupal 8 as the base for our upcoming web redesign, but our design vendor recommends Drupal 7 for its development. If we use PHP 7 on Pantheon, may there be a performance penalty using this older Drupal build?
So definitely that's a great question. I'd say sort of high level, PHP 7 is a new version of PHP that's come out. It's something that we're working on at Pantheon. It's in beta now. We'll be out relatively soon for everyone, and it's a much more performant version of PHP. That a lot of optimizations just to the language itself are there. So sites that like worked, can run, works with a certain way in PHP 5.6 will work in many cases faster in PHP 5.7. And doing something like New Relic to test before and after actually will show you just how fast your site will work. There are a few gotchas. Not all code is compatible with PHP 7. Sometimes you have to update the code to do some of the changes that have happened. Drupal 8 is very optimized for PHP 7. All of that code has been tested and is regularly tested PHP 7. Drupal 7, I think the core does work with PHP 7.
I think the core is fine. The issue is that you pretty much don't build the Drupal 7 site with just core.
Yeah.
You use contributed modules, and a good number of them were not tested with 7 or with the expectation of compatibility with 7. So insofar as it's possible to build the site with 8, it's just going to be a better experience with 7 because the community for the contrib modules is just expecting that is worthwhile. And let's say you ran into a compatibility issue with 7 in a module. It's much more likely that someone who wrote the module for Drupal 8 and is supporting a Drupal 8 module is going to be able to fix that for you or take a patch than if it's, say, a patch to a Drupal 7 version of the module.
That being said, Drupal 7 and the contrib modules can be made to work with PHP 7. There's a lot of people who will have this interest as well. And so you see a lot of PHP 7 patches existing in contrib space. So I think a good sort of review is think about your site, what contrib modules might you need to actually do this, look at if they're PHP 7 compatible or not, and then of course have a vendor who's going to write PHP compatible code. And the way to obviously know that is have your dev environment run PHP 7 as well as your test and production.
You can also now pick PHP 5.6 on Pantheon, which has more modest performance gains over 5.3 or 5.5.
Yeah.
But there are still some gains there in terms of 5.6. And so if I were building a Drupal 7 site, I would probably target that right now, unless I really, really needed to eke out the gains that PHP 7 provides. And I'm more willing to deal with all the caveats of that for Drupal 7.
No. I would probably just do it on PHP 7 and just see what breaks. We'll roll this out probably in the next week or week and a half, by the way, in case something crazy happens. And one of the good things about Pantheon is you could turn on PHP 7 for like a multi-dev environment and just review what it would look like.
We're implementing it all through Pantheon.yaml, which is the same way that you configure Quicksilver. And what that means is that even on a site that's already in production on PHP, say 5.5 or 5.6, you can start a multi-dev environment or switch dev over to PHP 7. And if that works great, PHP 7's configuration will flow with your deployment. So as soon as you deploy to test, the PHP version will toggle to the appropriate version along with your code base. So if you have a code base that works to fit and is configured to fit, we consider those to be kind of intrinsically related, that the code base has been tested against a certain version of PHP.
So, quick good tips. You want to make Drupal faster, enable New Relic today, start getting data, set up a load test and do some testing. When PHP 7 comes out, enable PHP 7 on a multi-dev environment and review performance and see if your stuff's compatible. And then just think critically about the work you're doing on a sort of data level. Just make sure your site can be faster. Every little second counts. Every little bit makes people happier, and getting it faster just improves everyone's situation. And why wouldn't we want to do that?
We're gonna sneak a couple more questions in here before we have to close it out. Next one is using SSL with Fastly adds a whole cost barrier, i.e. several $100s monthly for dedicated certificates on top of the traffic costs. Any suggestions on how to combine HTTPS and CDN in a more affordable manner?
I think Cloudflare is your best option there. Cloudflare provides free HTTPS as long as you are okay with them issuing the certificate for you. We actually have a documented configuration for integrating that way. And in a lot of ways, Cloudflare is sort of the everyman's CDN, where if you're sort of on the fence about whether you want a CDN or whether you want to pay for a CDN, then Cloudflare is a pretty good option to implement. Fastly just offers more of those niche features like VCL and more sophisticated configuration options and invalidation options around, say, tags of Drupal 8. But Cloudflare is fully Drupal compatible. A lot of Pantheon sites use it, and they support HTTP2 and fast TLS negotiations to provide that great last mile experience.
All right, I'm going to sneak one more in here for us. Does Pantheon have any recommendations for getting a 90+ score in Google PageSpeed tools? My biggest issue there is with optimizing images, yet nothing I've tried to better optimize the image style generated images on Pantheon seems to help the score.
So this is a tool Google provides. You can type your URL in and get a variety of sort of metrics around sort of how fast stuff is doing. It's pretty nice. I don't know specifically about the image stuff.
Yep. Well, there are some interesting things happening now with some CDNs offering to basically do that as a sort of man-in-the-middle thing, where they notice the image, they perform optimizations on it, and then they deliver the optimized image and cache it to the end users. I would have to see the exact remarks from Google about what it's complaining for the image optimization, because a lot of it actually depends on what the original image is. Yeah. Other things probably depend on, say, how GD or ImageMagick is configured to alter the image for something like the derivative versions. And I know that both of those offer various ways of configuring the options that are used for generating the derivative images, which I would probably say that more users are loading the derived images from Drupal sites than the originals.
Yep. All right, I'll sneak one more in here. And that is, what is your preferred cache lifetime for Varnish?
The best cache lifetime to use with Varnish is as long as possible. I would I would say that, because we do provide the ability to invalidate your cache.
It's a trade-off, right? Like you want to make sure that if you have a long cache time, that you have a mechanism to invalidate the cache. Because the last thing you want is somebody to post something to the site and expect their friends to see it, but then have to wait an hour for it to to have the cache be rebuilt.
Yeah. The other there are a few schools of thought. There's the short cache lifetime school of thought, where you don't really care that much about invalidation. You just have the cache items be short-lived, which still provides an enormous performance benefit to a site. There is the cache for a really long time and invalidate school, which provides, in some ways, the best of both worlds, but at the cost of complexity. And then, finally, there is the school of change the URL for things, which mostly works for other assets on the page, or things like AJAX items on the page. And then, basically, Drupal does this for aggregated CSS and JavaScript, where it just changes the URL, and instead of having to bother invalidating the previous item, it just changes what you request. It changes the cache key. But one thing I would emphasize is that no matter what you're doing, as long as you're willing to cache a page at all, it's important to cache it for at least, say, a second, because there's a world of difference between not caching a page at all and caching it for even a second in a CDN or a Varnish cache. Because when you cache a page for 1 second, you've put a cap where per cache, that page could never be requested from the origin more than 60 times per minute. Whereas if you don't cache it at all, you have a completely unbounded upper end of how often that could be requested from the origin. So I did a presentation at DrupalCon on scaling patch.com for Powerball night, and we only used a 15-second cache in the CDN, and we're not doing any invalidation in the CDN at all, but it was still hitting a 99% cache hit rate on Powerball night, and is normally hitting a cache hit rate that is in the 70 or 80th percentile, even though it's only 15 seconds.
And if you're really into some of this performance stuff, definitely check out David and Abe's talk from DrupalCon. It's recorded on the internet, Powerball, DrupalCon, you'll see it, and that's a nice thing to have. And here's the Usain Bolt image of him running super fast, winning the gold medal. Because we want your sites to be like this. We hope you do too. And thank you all for coming to the couch coding and doing a little bit of Drupal performance magic.
Thank you all so much for joining us. If you have any additional questions or feedback, please visit our website where you will find a contact us page, and we'll put you in touch with the best member of our team. Have a great week, everyone.